Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. I will talk about bridging the gap between formal information flow security analysis and real-world applications. This recorded talk is about 30 minutes long. Afterwards, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. The thesis of this talk is that information flow models are very useful at analyzing the security properties of applications, but there is a significant gap between traditional theory and modern systems. In this talk, we will first provide a historical view of applying lattice-based information flow security model to applications in the 70s. Then we'll show you a new application domain, which is the home IoT and end-user programming. We'll show you our work that try to apply the lattice-based information flow model to analyze the security properties of this new application. And then we'll have a follow-up study identifying the gaps between the theory and the application. And in the end, hopefully, I'll try to provide some possible solutions. Let's start with a very old application domain. The military and government need to keep their files secure. They want to make sure that only the correct personnel have access to sensitive files. What they do is that they issue clearances to people and assign security labels to files. On the right is an example set of clearances and also security labels. From bottom up, the label increase in their secrecy level. One question is, what is a proper security model for the policies so that the system is secure? One such model was proposed by Bell and LaPadula, BLP model. This model has two properties. One is called the simple security property, which is no read up. The other one is called the star property, which is no write down. Here's an example of the simple security property or no read up. We have one file here, which is labeled top secret. This file contains the nuclear launch codes. We have two people here. One is the US president, who has a top secret clearance. The other one is Homer Simpson, who has no clearances, meaning that he can only read public files. The no read up policy ensures that only people who has a clearance level at or above the top secret level can read this file. This means that the US president can read it, but Homer Simpson cannot. If you look at the clearances on the right, from top secret to open would be a direction of going down, not up. Here is an example of the star property, or no write down. We still have the same two people with the same clearances as the previous slide. Now we have Twitter, which is an open public channel. The no write down policy ensures that the US president cannot tweet anything that contains top secret, secret, or confidential information. On the other hand, Homer doesn't know anything, therefore he can tweet anything that he wants to. A side note is that it took me 4 years to be able to use the US president as an example for this. The BLP model only enforces secrecy properties. Later on, Biba proposed a model to enforce integrity properties. This is sometimes also called BLP upside down. I'll skip the details here. Back then, these models are still called access control models, even though the properties we're looking at actually are information flow type of properties. Biba and BLP also didn't explicitly form the clearances or security labels into a lattice. A couple years later, Dorothy Denning published a seminal paper, A Lattice Model for Secure Information Flow. In that paper, Denning showed that Biba and BLP models are examples of lattice-based model. The clearances on the right actually form a very simple lattice. Since then, the field of information flow security has advanced a lot. In this conference, we actually have 2 tracks on this topic. At the same time, there are new application domains keep showing up. One question is lattice-based information flow security model still useful in analyzing these new applications? Now we're going to look at one of them, smart home and end-user programming. We'll see whether information flow security model can be used to analyze the security concerns in this application. Smart home devices such as Alexa, Nest Camera, and smart light bulbs are becoming increasingly popular. I actually have quite a few of these inside my home. They are making our life a lot easier. However, they collect a lot of our private information, and most of them sit right inside our homes. Therefore, these devices could cause security and privacy harms to its users. When we put end-user programming tools into the mix, it could get even worse. These tools allow users to connect these devices to services such as Facebook and Gmail. The most popular end-user programming tool is called if this then that, or IFT. An if user can combine a trigger and action to write a applet or previously called recipe, and we're mostly going to refer to them as rules. It basically said, if this trigger happens, then perform that action. For example, I can say that if the multi-sensor installed on my mailbox is closed, then blink my light bulb so I know that I should go get my mail. We will call these trigger action programming, or TAP. Because these trigger events can capture our private state, and the action event may operate some important physical state like a lock, it's not surprising that there are security and privacy concerns. Here are some problematic rules. This one said, if I took a photo with my phone, then upload a public picture on Flickr. The intended use is that if I'm going sightseeing, I would like my friends to see all the cool places that I've been to. However, if I forgot to turn off this rule and I got home and took a photo of my passport, then all my private information would have been leaked as a public photo on Flickr. Here another example. We have seen this one before. If my mailbox sensor is closed, then blink my hue light. The intended use is that I want to be informed of my mails. The unintended use is that neighbor's kid can stop by and fill in with my mailbox, and I will be very bothered by the blinking lights. So the first example demonstrated some secrecy problems, and the second example demonstrated integrity problems. And we know what are the good formal models for analyzing such problems. Therefore, we're going to apply information security modeling to analyze the security and privacy concerns of IFT applets. Here is how we go about modeling. I put the if rule on the bottom. Each if rule is really a very simple event handler. It takes triggering events as input and generate an action event as output. This action event can be itself another triggering event or can cause a triggering event that will trigger another rule and generate another action event. So these rules can be chained together. An attacker is someone who can interact with these rules by generating triggering events and observing action events. To perform information flow analysis, we need to define our security lattice. That would require us to look at the triggers and actions, categorize them, and find the proper labels for our security lattice. Once this is done, we can analyze our rules or applets for information flow security violations. So our security label is composed of a pair of a secrecy label and an integrity label. And we'll discuss the secrecy label first. The first step is to decide what's the meaning of the secrecy label. And we have settled on the following. For a trigger, the secrecy label denotes who can know that the trigger has occurred. Similarly, for the action, the secrecy label denotes who can know that this action has occurred. Some of you may already have seen issues with this, and we'll come back to this in later slides. After going over all the triggers and actions, we come up with the following 4 labels. So on the bottom, we have public, meaning anybody can see it, for example, a public photo. On the top, we have private, meaning only the device or rule owner can see it, for example, an email. In the middle, these 2 labels, restricted online and restricted physical, allow a limited group of people to see the events. Restricted online means that a group of people allowed by the sharing setting of a service can see it, for example, share Google Drive or Alexa recording. Restricted physical means that a group of people within a physical space can see it. For example, when a light bulb blinks, anybody near the window of the house can see it. Now, let's look at integrity labels. For integrity, similarly, we're going to look at what's the meaning of it first. For trigger, the integrity label denotes who can cause this trigger. For action, the label denotes who can cause this action. For integrity, we come up with very similar labels. So the middle 2 labels are the same as the secrecy label, and I will not explain further. On the bottom, we have trusted, meaning only the device owner or the service owner can trigger it. On top, we have untrusted, meaning anybody can trigger it. Given the lattices, now we can actually explain some of the violating rules. Note that when we mark trigger or action, some of the triggers and actions have ambiguous labels, so we're going to have sometimes associated with each trigger and action multiple labels. For the first rule, the action of taking a photo with my phone, this can be labeled as private if I'm in a space by myself, or restricted physical when I'm in a public space, many people can see me. The action of public photo to Flickr is public. Now, this rule allows information flow from private or restricted physical to public. Therefore, this is a violation of secrecy. Next, in the following rule, the trigger mailbox sensor is closed is labeled as restricted physical. Anybody around my mailbox can see my mailbox is closed. The action blink hue light is labeled as trusted, meaning I can blink the hue light, or restricted online, meaning anybody who has the hue app and is allowed to operate the light can operate this hue light as well. Similarly here, for integrity, this rule allows restricted physical event to influence an action that's supposed to be trusted or restricted online, and this flow is not allowed by the lattice. So we implemented our analysis in Prolog and analyzed a large database of publicly available IFT recipes. This database contains over 19,000 IFT recipes. Here is the analysis result. Over 50% of the recipes are flagged as violating. And among them, 33% of them have integrity violations, 27% of them has secrecy violations, and 10% has both. So this exercise demonstrates again that information flow models can serve as a formal foundation for analyzing security properties of real applications. But the results are a little bit surprising in that a large fraction of the recipes are flagged as violating. Do they really pose harms to users? We want to know, do our results apply to real users' programs? In particular, we want to know what fractions of users if applets are violating practice. How much and what types of harms are if users actually exposed to? The publicly available recipes do not contain enough information about triggers and actions. For example, this if rule just said that the trigger is a SmartThings sensor closed. This sensor can be mounted on a mailbox or main entrance of a building or a door to a safe. These locations has very different implications of security and integrity. Similarly, the trigger is post a message to Slack. It's unclear who can view the message of a Slack. Is this a Slack channel to coworkers or to the family? So to find out, we conducted a user study. We collected 743 rules from 28 study participants. We're hoping to find out more information about users' rules. For example, participant 28 has a rule, if front door sensor closed, then post a message to a Slack service. Here, we know where the sensor is mounted, but we still don't have information about a Slack channel. So first, we rerun our analysis on users' set of rules, and the result ended up to be very similar to our previous analysis. Here we have over 59% of the users' rules are being flagged as violating. Next, we look at the data in more detail. We want to answer the question, did the analysis accurately identify violating applets? And the second question is, does violation imply harmful and vice versa? The first question is, among the recipes that our tool flagged as violating, are these actually violating? So the answer is no. Here's an example. This applet said, if new tweet by a specific first person, then add a row to Google Sheet. Our analysis would mark the tweet by a specific user as being restricted online or public, because we don't know the setting of that tweet. For the action, our tool would flag it as being public or restricted online or private. This also depends on the Google Sheets sharing setting. When we look at the participants rule, it says save every tweet from the US president. Now, because this tweet is actually public, therefore, there isn't any violation in this user's rule. This is a false alarm raised by our analysis tool. So the answer to the question of whether all the applets flagged as being violating by our analysis tool actually violating is no. What about the other side? Are all these apps being marked as non-violating, not violating? The answer is also no. Okay, here's an example. Consider the following hypothetical rule where both the trigger and action are being marked as restricted online. Our tool will not mark this as violating because the trigger and action has the exact same label. However, in practice, this restricted online could be something shared within the family, versus this restricted online for the action is something shared between coworkers. You don't necessarily want information flow between these two. The second question we want to ask is, does violation imply harm and vice versa? Here, the answer is also no. Let's look at a few examples. This rule says, if motion detected in front yard, then turn on security camera. This rule actually has a integrity violation. People outside the house near the front yard can trigger the motion sensor, but only the user of the camera should be able to turn on the security camera. However, this rule is not harmful. Actually, the users themselves intend to have this monitoring rule. Here another example. It says, if Sam's presence is detected, then create journal entry. Because the journal entry is private, so there isn't a secrecy violation. But this can cause Sam to be monitored by whoever owns the journal and the monitoring device itself. After we dig a little bit deeper, we realize that there is a gap between the model and the application. Next, we want to figure out what are the gaps. For us to be able to accurately identify violations and harms, we need a lot of contextual information. Let's assume that Alex is the owner of the device and the rules. In the following rule, we first have to be able to answer the question of where is the sensor located at and how is the Google Sheet being shared. Without this type of information, we would not be able to accurately identify the secrecy and integrity labels of these triggers and actions. Next, we need to know who is the attacker and what do the attackers know. For example, the attacker could be Alex's curious friends or potential thieves. The one difference between these two sets of attackers is that Alex's curious friend might know something about Alex's devices at home or Alex's rules, versus it's very unlikely for potential thieves to know what's Alex's setup. So this leads to the question of, do the attacker know Alex's rules? Interestingly, probably they do not. This is actually in contradiction with the standard information flow control assumptions where the attackers know the entire program. Here, the program are these rules. Whether the attacker knows the rules or not impact the harm the attacker could cause to the users. And next, the information in the action actually differs. Here, we can ask a question of what can we derive from seeing the entry in the Google Sheet. The user might simply put a check mark every time the sensor is activated, or it can put a lot of information. For example, it would say the address of the place and which door is being opened. For an attacker that do not know the rules, only see the Google Sheet entry check, the attacker may not be able to understand what has happened. Under the assumption of the strong attacker model, where the attacker knows where Alex installed the rules and where Alex placed devices are known to the attackers, the attacker, just by observing this checkmark entry, can derive backward and obtain the same information as someone who have observed the more informative second entry. Okay, continue our discussion that our attacker model is not nuanced enough. We also missed a new attack scenario, harms to incidental users. These users are not the ones who own or set up the devices. Instead, they might be a guest to a house or doing cat sitting for the house. Nonetheless, they come in contact with these devices and their privacy could have been violated. Using the example we've shown before, let's assume that Alex set up the rule that if Sam's presence is detected, then create journal entry. Here, there's no harm to Alex. Instead, Alex can use this rule to monitor somebody else namely Sam, in the house. In this new attack scenario, the attacker is actually the device and rule owner. The victims are incidental users such as roommates, partners, people who come in to service the house such as cat sitters. Our prior analysis has considered device and rule owners are the victims of the attacks. Interestingly, in this new attack model, the attacker, being the device and rule owner, do know all the setups and also where all the devices are located and what are the rules being configured. The lattice-based information flow model is elegant and allows us to do some analysis. But when we try to accurately identify harm to the users, this model becomes inadequate. Let's see an example. It said, if new alert from Nest camera, then upload video to shared drive. Let's see how we would annotate the trigger itself. We said that the security label of the trigger should indicate who can know that the trigger has occurred. In this example, we're looking at a Nest camera, so the label will be labeled as restricted physical, meaning who knows that there's movement near the Nest camera. But if we look at what information has been propagated from trigger to action, this information is about the person who triggered the Nest camera. In other words, this trigger carries information about incidental users. Our security label is too coarse-grained to be used for that. Just to summarize, after further investigation using a user study, we realized that our automated analysis is not accurate enough. Further, violating isn't the same as being harmful, and users are more likely to pay attention if it's really harmful. The gap is that the standard information flow model is inadequate because we lack important contextual information. We're also using a single, also already strong attacker model here. Here is a clip from the Big Bang Theory explaining the shortcomings of modeling.
Okay. How about this? There's this farmer, and he has these chickens, but they won't lay any eggs. So he calls a physicist to help. The physicist then does some calculations, and he says, I have a solution, but it only works with spherical chickens in a vacuum.
So how can we close the gap and help real users? First, we have to enrich our model so that we can capture real users' environments and concerns. And then we have to have our tool interface with the user better. To help the user, we would like to develop an automated analysis tool based on our enriched model so that the user can input into the rule their tabs and device settings so that this input can capture a lot of the useful contextual information a very accurate analysis would need. Then the analysis tool would run some algorithm and produce some useful warnings and recommendations to the users so that these information will be useful to guide the users to change their settings for the better. To improve our model, we have to consider different aspects that we have not considered before. So it's still useful to divide the properties into two main categories, secrecy and integrity. However, for attackers, we cannot assume that the attacker knows the program. Instead, the attacker could range from someone who have complete knowledge of the setup and the rules, or someone who only have partial or no knowledge of the setup at all. For the target or targeted victim, this includes not just device and rule owners, this also includes incidental users such as cat sitter and roommates that we have discussed earlier. Next, it's probably useful to refine the category of secrecy and integrity violations into more finer-grained harms. For example, it could be a cause of embarrassment or loss of privacy, or maybe this would cause discomfort to the users. Here are some examples of harm that we would like our analysis tool to be able to analyze. For example, Alex's partner could monitor Alex by turning on the security cameras. Another example is that an Airbnb host could turn up the thermostat to make the guests feel uncomfortable. Third, someone could embarrass Alex by tagging Alex in an unflattering photo, which appears in a shared folder. The last one is that Alex's private schedule could be known to Alex's coworkers if the calendar entry appeared on a shared calendar. The first two are harms to incidental users, while the last two are harms to device and rule owners. So how do we go about this? For us to do any formal analysis, things has to be mathematically modeled. So the input to the tool has to be templated enough so that the tool can use an automated algorithm to analyze it. But this input also has to contain rich information so that we can have the hope to do some sort of accurate analysis. One possible way to do this is to categorize the events based on type of contextual information that we would need to ask the users about. For example, we can categorize event types into things like sensing IoT device state, or outgoing communication, or logging a notification, and so on. Instead of, or in addition to having a simple label like secret or private associated with triggers and actions, we're going to attach additional attributes that can help the analysis later. These attributes differ based on the event type. To collect these attributes, we can ask users a set of templated questions. For example, for sensing IoT device state, we might ask, what do you expect to affect IoT device state? For example, presence detected. Another example question would be, what type of location is the sensor located? Is it a private room, is it in a living space, or outside the house? For outgoing communications, we can ask questions like, who will see this outgoing communication? Does the message include any type of private information? Can or how likely the recipient of the communication can infer the triggering events? In addition to input, we also have to improve our output so that our tool can generate useful feedback to users. For example, it's probably fairly easy for us to tell the user that you have a problem because private flows to public, or because public can influence private. This would be standard problem with information flow violations. However, this is unlikely to be understood by the users, therefore they're going to ignore this warning. Instead, it's probably more useful to say something like, when garage door is open, anyone with the URL or shared access to the Google Sheet can see a new entry with the house address and entry time. Or that when garage door is open, anyone with the URL or shared access to the Google Sheet and know your setup can deduce that your garage door is open. We're hoping that the output is still templated, but the output can contain a lot more information so the user can understand or can assess whether this would be harmful or not. In the end, we have to develop analysis algorithms that can support the rich format of the model, the input and output. You can see that now this analysis has gone way beyond the simple analysis we have done in our first study. So we're reaching the end of my talk. The takeaway is that I'm happy that the formal information flow modeling is still quite useful for analyzing the security and privacy concerns in modern applications. So in other words, the model itself is truly foundational. However, closing the gap between this abstract model and the application can be quite challenging. Through our analysis, we found out that actually there are quite different attacker models. We have to consider incidental users. We have to consider situations where the attacker don't know about the program, but may be able to deduce parts of the program. To be able to accurately understand harms, we have to collect a lot of contextual information, including sharing setting, where device is located, and so on. This kind of information collection is extremely difficult for an automated analysis tool. We're still hopeful that we can make real impact by applying formal modeling to analyzing real systems that can actually eventually help the user. This can only work if we work with experts in other fields like human-computer interface. Okay, we're done. I would like to thank all my collaborators. The first two are McKenna and Abhishek. They're here at the conference. If you're interested in the project, grab them and ask them lots of questions. Now I'm ready to take questions and hear your comments.